to the place where singles shine, celebrating life, divine by design. Faith and love, we intertwine. Route 77, where your journey's prime.
Welcome to the Route 77 podcast. Today we're diving into a topic that resonates with many, particularly those experiencing long-term or lifelong singleness, loneliness. It's a theme prevalent in countless discussions and even more so on platforms like TikTok, where I've noticed an uptick in conversations about the deep sense of loneliness many singles feel. But is this loneliness really being about being single, or is there more to unpack here? That's what we're going to explore. So let's get into it, and hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll have a clearer understanding of what it truly means to feel lonely and how to address it. Welcome to the Route 77 podcast. I am your host, Natasha, and I am here with Monique.
Hello.
And David.
Hello.
Yeah. I was perusing TikTok, and one of the only reasons I have TikTok is just so that I can see what people are talking about in regards to singleness and things like that. So my TikTok algorithms are starting to kick in now to show me the things that I'm looking for. And I had been thinking about this topic idea before I had seen this TikTok, but it cemented it into me that I think we needed to talk about it. And it was talking about just loneliness and singleness. And actually quite a few are popping up now with people talking about how lonely they are in long-term singleness or lifelong singleness. And I thought it would be a good thing to talk about because it's something that you hear a lot. And it's something that I think that I have felt, but I also think that the loneliness that we consider singles to feel is not what we think it is, or what we really, it's not the loneliness that we think we're talking about, really, I think, when we look into it. If that sort of makes sense. But hopefully it'll make sense at least by the time that we're done this podcast.
It actually does make sense because I do know, listening to that lady's TikTok, recalling having those feelings myself when I was living by myself in the early part of my singleness. I'm going to qualify because that feeling started to leave. But I do know that there are some other fears that go along with it as well. So we can get into that too later.
And I think I felt what she was describing all the way through my 20s. But anyway, so what about you, David?
It was. I said this in the last podcast, like what we did with fear. Before I ever knew Christ, or before I fully was understood what he did and how much I was invested in him, I was completely void of emotion. There wasn't a single emotion. I didn't have fear, concern, worry. I didn't feel lonely. It was in a sense more terrifying than if I actually felt lonely. Because I could have done horrible things and not feel anything. And then when I finally actually felt the love of Christ, that's when I actually started to begin feeling emotions and realizing what I actually lost. So I don't really have something like you, or an experience like you or Monique, where I felt lonely or anything. It was just the utter absence of almost anything. All emotion for me.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I guess the first thing we can just talk about what is understanding loneliness and singleness. It's just, I think that people are saying that they're lonely because they don't have what they perceive other people have. There is a sort of FOMO thing of going on, of fear of missing out. But I want to say that there's also two possible sins that are going on here. And one is discontent and one is envy. It's like your fear of missing out on something that is good, which is a relationship and marriage and children, which is good. But you feel like you're missing out on something that other people get. So if you want something that other people have, that's envy or coveted.
I'm going to jump in and say, yeah, that might be some of it. And I'm trying to recall the things that I remember saying in my times of loneliness is that, number one, I had nobody to talk to. There's nobody there, nobody's shoulder I could cry on. Sleeping alone. When you've been married, you have that, even though it was very rare because he liked to sleep on the couch rather than with me. So I was far more lonely in my marriage than I was without. There was that sense of somebody being in the room with you. There's that fear, especially if you're an older individual. This is where people, I think, get loneliness and alone mixed up. Because if you've got that fear, if I die, there's going to be nobody there to find me. Nobody cares about me. Nobody loves me. Nobody calls me. Nobody comes to visit me. Nobody sees me. If I died tonight, who would miss me? So I think that comes along. But this is where I think
they talk about it as if relationship and marriage is going to fix it. They're not looking for any other fulfillment of or thing that can change their lonely feeling other than romantic relationship. That's the only possible fix. And that's usually when you see people talking about it, that is what they're focusing on.
Yeah, it's that romantic fix. Their hormones are saying they got this itch and there's nobody to scratch it.
Partly
To put it in a kind but still a serious thing, is that really that's what it is that your sexual desires are speaking so loudly because you're paying so much attention to it that you think that where it has to be. This is what I'm missing. I'm missing out on somebody giving me that love and attention and stuff like that we see in all these romantic movies and happily ever after. And it feeds into that loneliness.
And when you have this expectation of that romantic relationship fixing this, then it can lead to a lot of unmet expectations.
Yeah.
And because unless the person fulfills your romantic imaginary version of what they're supposed to do in order to make this feeling go away, then if they fail you at all, then it's like, oh, this isn't the right one. Or even though they're like a regular person too, and maybe and I consider like where I was in my 20s, where I totally felt like alone because I saw everybody getting married. And I think it had less to do with me being alone than it had to do with not a fear of missing out, but I don't get to have what these other people are having, which again, I want to say is a form of covetousness. And I think we're told in the Bible that we're not supposed to judge yourself on other people's lives, like where God has placed you versus another person. And it's hard because I don't want to be like, you're a sinner and whatever. Like, I'm not trying to bash anybody down, but I think sometimes we need to look deep into the heart of what it is that we're actually feeling or doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're diving into the roots then, going into, and I think people misunderstand or don't know fully what they think loneliness actually is. It's like again, the romantic nature of it. And when I watched that girl explain to me, there was a lot of, it was hard to follow because I don't think she fully understood what she was really saying or how to relate or like fully understood how to explain her loneliness. She didn't know really. It didn't seem like she knew what loneliness she was trying to express.
And I think that would go with anybody who wants to go and talk about their feelings of loneliness because you can't describe it. And a lot of times what it is that I can't explain it. Seriously, you can't, because it's a woe is me feeling. It's a self-pity feeling that you have, thinking that nobody loves you, nobody wants to be with you. There's got to be something wrong with you. And it all has a lot to do with how you see yourself.
And a lot of them, like when it comes up with several different people over the time, it was actually a lot of people saying, I never got picked. I never got to be a person that somebody picked. In a sense, like even in a romantic relationship of a dating relationship or something. And I understand that must hurt a lot when they see people around them have people come up and ask them out on dates and it never happened to you. And I'm not saying that these feelings of hurt don't exist or even that loneliness itself doesn't exist. I'm just saying in this specific way, people are that seem to be like talking about it as if like the fix is a romantic relationship.
And I think society has they push it so hard for people to be in a relationship. We have 8 billion people on the planet. I can't stress that enough because they were talking about how the birth rate has dropped and stuff like that. And I'm going, there are always going to be people who are going to have babies. Why does it have to be something that you have to do? Because eventually people are going to, I said, we have 8 billion people on this planet. They're not all going to drop off the face of the earth at one time.
A significant amount of people get married and have children.
Exactly.
It's higher than
But because society has given such a high importance to it, that if you're one of those people that just don't click with anybody else, you get looked down upon, or you feel like you get looked down upon. So you start to think that there's something wrong with you, that you will never find somebody to love. But maybe it's that there's just nobody good enough for you. How's that?
But even like, I was thinking about it a lot. Like my single life in my 20s, I had my family around me. I was doing sports, which I loved. I did love being on the farm. I had my church family and things like that. And yet I was going around saying I'm so lonely because I wasn't in a romantic relationship. Unmet expectations, discontentment, envy of those who, like my brother, who got somebody and got to have children. So, but then I'm here now in my 40s and I'm surrounded by friends. I'm doing sports that I love. Have a church family. Like, it's not much different in theory than I was in my 20s. And yet I don't have that lonely feeling. Like I have you as my friend and I have my church. So I have the same thing because my perspective has changed. And yes, I went through a bad marriage. So but I'm not like anti-marriage and I'm not like, hey, there's no one ever out there for me ever, or maybe there isn't, but I'm not looking really. But like it's because my heart has changed towards it.
Yeah.
And so while my life is essentially the same in my 40s as it was in my 20s in a sense, and yet how I feel in it is like a complete 180 of what I was then. Like it's a complete opposite.
That's what Christ ends up doing. It's incredible because, and I see this a lot too. People are like, oh, this situation's really bad. But then when they get to know Christ and they understand the love he shares for us, it's like, I don't know how to express what it does. It's just like, I'm in the same position. And the only difference is Christ. And yet it's a radically different feeling. But
David, you should listen to Mercy Me's Hands Up. You'll get it. That's exactly what the song is about. I can't describe it, but hands up if you feel it. But seriously, when my late husband passed away, I went through a period of time where I was almost in a desperate sense of wanting to find somebody else. And thank you, Lord, for doing this to me. Every person that was around me was either 20 years too young or 20 years too old. It's just no way any of that's going to, no, I'm not going to cougar, and no, I don't want an old man. I went through a period there for, I think, maybe 10 years where I was so desperately lonely, but I would channel myself and went into areas where I had disappeared. People said that I became like a hermit. I wouldn't talk to anybody. I would go to work, but I would go to work and go home. And then I'd go to church. And then I'd go home. And then I'd go to work. And then I'd go home. I would just spend all my time either watching TV or watching TV. I watched a lot of TV. And it wasn't until I started Taekwondo that I started to break out of my shell. And that was not that long ago. That was only 2017. It's amazing what God will use to break you out of your shell. But these are some of the consequences of when you don't.
What you said, Monique, reminds me of Psalm 68:6. And it says, God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing. But the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land. It reminds me of how God is always watching you, is always looking after you. And then when you do feel lonely, he's just, I'm going to place you in this kind of family or this kind of community.
Yeah.
So he's always caring.
And it's funny that you mentioned that first, because that's exactly what he did. Is he said, okay, I've had enough of you sitting around moping like a sad sap, thinking that, because he obviously had a better plan for me. I didn't want to acknowledge that plan. I didn't want to think that he wanted me to be alone for the rest of my life. But it was funny how even during that time, when I would think it would be nice to get married and have more kids, because I was still young enough then, that he would say, it would almost be like, I don't know if he was saying it or he's bringing it to mind. So if you had another baby, how would that work with Amber, with my daughter? And what would that look like? And I would always feel extremely uncomfortable in that feeling for some odd reason. It was almost like I was choosing a different child over her, that a child that was normal, if you get what I'm saying. And just by God playing those scenes in my head would make me feel really uncomfortable with myself, to the point where I think I was, as much as I wanted to have a relationship, I think I started to literally avoid wanting one, until it got to the point where it's, yeah, now I just don't want it. And then other things started to change. I had to have a hysterectomy, and that brought a whole lot of other issues where I had to really ask myself if I was really giving up the idea of having any children, because I could still, and the doctor said, if you want to have more children, we can help you with that, the in vitro kind of thing, because I'm sure that's something that they've done a lot of. And so I had a year before my operation to think about whether or not I wanted to have another child before I had that removed. And I chose to not have any more kids.
One of the things that is very fascinating to me about your experience there, Monique, is that, and I don't think a lot of people may not see it this way, but in a sense, it's comforting in regards to how God always knows the hearts and the emotions of others. And maybe he was relaying the emotions of your daughter to yourself, because in a sense, your daughter may have felt like if you had a brother or a sister, that she was that important, like you were mentioning again, that you would give all your time to your other child. You can't possibly know how your daughter would feel in that situation.
No.
But it is possible, because God can reveal in dreams and whatnot. So maybe he was revealing to you how she would feel in that kind of regard. But this is just a theory or speculation. But
I think it was more that he was showing me how I would end up feeling, because then my heart would be divided. Not that I would love one child over the other, but that the importance of Amber, and especially with all the stuff that she has gone through in the last while and how much attention she has had to take because of that, it really made me realize, even more so now looking back, that had I had another child, I might not have, I would have felt probably guilty trying to divide my time up between two children, both who needed me equally, and I couldn't give that same attention equally. So it was like, it was God saying, you had no idea what I am sparing you of. You may not see it now, but you will see it later, how much I am sparing your life and your heart from the kind of hurt that could have come from a lot of that. And he has been so miraculously amazing with her life. But as much as I was so lonely in that early time, I think once I had my hysterectomy, that's about when I started to give up on even having a relationship. Not entirely, but because then that part of me was gone. And that was what was driving a lot of my feelings, was wanting to have more kids.
Yeah, and I think for me, a lot of my motivation was wanting to be a mom. And how do you do that as a Christian woman? You need to get married to a guy.
Married. Because the thing with the Virgin Mary only happens once.
All the other ways that are not really, I think, ethically or
No.
what I should do. But it's just, yeah, like a lot of the motivation of my loneliness was that and again, like wanting to be married and having kids is not a bad thing. We're
No, it's not.
constantly told that this is a good thing. But just because something is good does not mean you have to have it.
Right.
And if you, it's not even wrong to wish for it or want it or pray for it. But if you start to develop resentment, discontent, envy, anger, all these things, when you don't get it, then I think you've placed it in an improper place in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. You have turned it into a God thing, which is a
Yes.
very bad thing, because
But-
it is one of those things that becomes, and I remember seeing like everybody I see is, they're married, they're walking down the street with their kids. I remember sitting in church and watching the little kids giving their little presentations to the whole church, and my heart breaking and crying because my daughter couldn't be in that, and that I had no kid in that, watching the baptisms and stuff. And it took a little bit to get over that. But I think once I made the decision that Amber was going to be my one and only child on this earth, a lot of that started to ease up over time. It wasn't, now I can watch the kids sing and go, I'm so glad they're not mine.
It's great being an aunt. You just can play with them and then send them home, which is good. I love when I just send them back to you. With Taekwondo, you can enjoy the kids and even the babies, but then they go home and you're like an actual aunt. But yeah, it's interesting when you look at, I'll read just a few verses. Deuteronomy 31:6. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Matthew 28:20. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Psalm 23:4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. 1 Peter 5:7. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And we could go on. I just wanted to read several so people could see the theme. The theme, I think, if I want to point it out, is that when you are truly feeling loneliness, God is the one to fulfill that and create the feeling of not being alone.
I've got something to say about that. And you knew I was gonna. Because if I don't play the devil's advocate, who's gonna? I had those verses said to me multiple times during my single life when I was feeling, God is always with you. Yeah. He is an invisible God. There's no shoulder for me to lean on. Sometimes you just need a shoulder to lean on. Sometimes you just need somebody to hug you. Really. You just need somebody to put their arms around you and say, it's going to be okay. Tell me your woes. Tell me your stories.
I just want to say, like, when you look at the verses, does any single verse actually say, if you're lonely, go get married?
No.
And I think the one that David quoted at the beginning was interesting because he says, God sets the lonely in families. And so he doesn't just say, come to him.
Paul said, if you can't control yourself, go get yourself married.
But there's other interpretations of that. I just find it interesting because none of them say, if you're lonely, go get married. Marriage is a cure for loneliness. Like none of those say that. Because the root of it is not your significant other.
And it's really hard for the single lonely person to hear those verses when they're stuck in their cycle of loneliness. I know that many people used to say to me the same thing. Seek first the kingdom of God and all these things will be added to you.
The problem I found is like they never actually explained anything. Like, what are some practical things I'm supposed to be doing right now? Because it's always, you're supposed to get married. You're supposed to get married. You're supposed to get married and have kids. Do whatever it takes, type of thing. But there's never any sort of discussion of, okay, what am I supposed to be doing? Like, I remember when I took my teaching degree, they told us a whole bunch of things that we shouldn't do to punish students. Don't write their name on the chalkboard. Don't make them do lines. Don't keep them in. But they never once told us any ideas of what we should do. And in here, I'm not saying it like, oh, we should just tell them this and leave them and let them figure it out. I just wanted to point out that there's like a theme of God's answer for loneliness. And
he didn't say go get married. He said, lean on me.
He's not saying Do everything in your power to get married, and then you'll be not lonely.
I think loneliness is just a human thing because even when you're married, I don't know about your marriage because you have your own experience with your husband, but I know with mine, even though my husband would be in the same house as me, he was never present. He wasn't with me. He would be on the couch watching TV. He would eat the food. He would sleep on the couch. And that was our marriage. So how was that any different from me living by myself, except I had all the food, I had all the dishes, I had all the bed, I had all the couch, I had all the TV, and I didn't have to worry about him. And
In theory, you had what you wanted in a sense. There was a physical person to cry on. There was a physical person to hug. And it didn't work out in the way that you thought it would.
no, because
And I'm not
he
saying
wasn't
like
there.
every husband or wife is going to be like that, like we experienced. There will be people who are so totally there and make you feel not alone. But it's not because they are your spouse. That's
No.
not the reason that you're not alone. It's because they're your family.
Yeah.
And that takes on so many different what that means to be family.
And you don't have to have a spouse to have a family. We all have our blood families. My blood family lives in another province, so do yours. David's family lives in another township.
If you're talking about direct family, right?
Yeah, your parent.
Yeah, immediate.
We don't always have access to our blood family, but we have a church family. And maybe the first person on your phone list isn't available, but the second person might be. You don't always have to go to the pastor as a person to cry with, right? There are numerous people in the church that can come around you and be part of your life.
And as you invest yourself in your church family and with your time and your energy, then you eventually develop those bonds with the people. Like you have so many people that you are really closely bonded with in that church because you've been there for so long. In a sense where you can go up to them and be this person, and how's your husband, and how's your kid, or how's this, and how's your mom, and all these things. And you can, because you know their life, and then they'll come up and say, hey, like, how's Amber doing? Or I know she was going through it, because they know your life. You're not just, and we can't know everybody that way, but over time, you start developing your niche kind of family within that church family. Just there's cousins that you might be closer to than other cousins, partly because you spend so much time with them or you have a similar personality or interest. The same thing in the church. You're going to have some church members that you're closer to and you develop bonds with in a different way.
It's interesting. You were also mentioning things like biblical insights into, and you mentioned Elijah, and I'm going, Elijah? What's Elijah's story?
I think it was a lot of him and God, I think.
God provided comfort and companionship.
I think if I were to think about a lonely person, looking at Jesus and how often he had so many people around him, but he said, I have no home or no place to lay my head. Foxes have holes, but he's just out in the dirt.
It's like after when he proved the power of God over the 450 prophets of Baal, and then Jezebel vowed to kill him, and then Elijah went into a deep state of fear, despair, and isolation. And he went to the wilderness where he sits under a tree and was basically like, kill me, God, because that's all that's left. He felt abandoned by the entirety of all the people. And he felt very alone. It must be difficult to be a prophet to a king and queen like that and a people of that time who just didn't want to do anything that God said.
It reminds me of Jonah. Didn't Jonah do the same thing? He went and sat up on top of a hill all by himself, waiting for Nineveh to crash, and it never did.
Yeah.
Well, I put a plant over him, and then the plant withered.
And he was yelling at the plant. Yeah.
It's when we think of ourselves as more than we are.
The thing is, like, Elijah knew that God was there.
Yeah.
Like, he just saw God kill 450 people with his power, and he knew God was there. So you can, again, be like, hey, it says to go to God if you're lonely. But there is, and again, I'm not denying that there is like this of isolation and loneliness that we can feel. I think my biggest point is that romantic relationships aren't going to be the solution for it.
All these names are coming into my head. You think of the disciples and Paul being imprisoned. Paul by himself for years in a prison with nobody to talk to but the guards.
Because they all deserted him over time.
Yeah. I don't know if he ever expressed his feelings of being lonely.
What's interesting too, though, is that if you notice, like with all of these people going around doing these work, they pretty much didn't go alone. Like it was Paul and Barnabas, or John Mark, and it was there, and things like that. And just when they were in the prison, when they got released, there was several of them, because they were doing these things together. And it just shows like God did not mean for us to do this life, to do the ministry single-handedly alone. And I think if people, if they think they're going to go do it all themselves, then that's where true loneliness can come in, because you actually end up cutting yourself off from them because you're not opening yourself up, or you're saying, I'm too independent, I can do this on my own. And I think even for you and I, Monique, like one of the things we were doing for a while was that, like, I don't need a guy, I can do it on my own, but then realized that there was a benefits to us going to live together in a house in separate bedrooms, as we keep saying, but that we found that there was like this not aloneness, this feeling of companionship that you can get from being a like-minded individuals sharing life.
There's I was just searching on Paul and loneliness, and there's this part in 2 Timothy 4:9-12 where Paul is being sentenced to die and asks Timothy to come and see him. That's one of those things where Paul craved Timothy's fellowship all the more in the wake of losing Demas.
In 2 Timothy 4:16-17, it says but he also showed that God was there with him through it, even when other people deserted him. And I don't think that's the fix, is like just going into, and again, we don't want to go, Paul is like basically saying, go and live a hermit life and just be you and God. Again, that's not, I think, the answer. But
No.
I think when it comes to times when you have been left on your own and you be tempted to go, woe is me, everyone has deserted me, we have to understand that God has not. And that thinking that is not right. Thinking that woe is me is allowed in a sense, because God, and we saw Jesus, like you've talked about, Jesus was denied by those closest to him. They left him in the garden, they slept, like he was left. And even to the point of going to hell, where God the Father turned his back on him. So if you want to have anybody who is truly alone, then I think he was
completely forsaken for. Thankfully, it didn't remain that way because he's God. But yeah, he knows exactly what it means to be betrayed, to be deserted, to be left without any comfort whatsoever. There was
You cannot write a more tragic story than the life of Jesus.
And then we bemoan our low. Oh, I'm so lonely.
And we go, I never got married and have kids. And you're like, neither did Jesus. It's not like there's so many things like Jesus went through that we can't be like, he doesn't know, because he knows. He's been through it all. And we can't. I think when we tempted to go, woe is me, Jesus actually had it worse every single time than what we think we have it. And it's only by his grace and the fact that he did that and that he lowered himself to do that, that we have the communion with God that we have, and the strength that we can have through him, and the feeling of not being alone that we have in God and in Christ.
It's not just that, though, too. Don't forget that Jesus also knows what it's like to have children. He created all of us in a different light and in a different manner.
We are
birthed all of us into existence, created all of us, gave us the breath of life. So also keep in mind that he also knows what it's like to lose and have children as well.
Yeah.
Be a father.
Yeah.
There's a song. If I were to be asked what is my favorite Christian band, I'm going to have to say Mercy Me, hands down, because
Hands Up.
Hands Up. It was that too. There are so many songs that I can relate to that they sing. And because it's just, yeah, I feel that. I feel that. None of them is more profound for me than when I first heard the song I Can Only Imagine, because that was during an extremely lonely time for me. I was by myself. I was feeling really low, but I would always, whenever I needed a hug, I would just close my eyes and imagine myself at the feet of Jesus and him just having his arms around me and holding me close. And I've seen pictures of people doing this, having those same images and stuff. And then I would imagine that vision quite a lot during a lot of my loneliest times. And then all of a sudden, this song came out, and I cried every time I heard that song for months. And it became my number one favorite song. It still is one of my favorite songs. If you believe that Jesus isn't there to comfort you, just close your eyes and imagine it. And imagine what it would feel like. And you could actually feel his arms around you.
Sometimes those arms come from those that are close to you.
Yes, but sometimes if there's no arms around you, Jesus can and will put his arms around you. And because there are times, like when I was living in my condo, it was long before I knew you. And even though I did have other friends, there are times where just at 9 o'clock at night on a middle of the week, a lot of people are already in bed or getting ready to go to bed. I can't just call up somebody. Most of my friends were married with kids. You feel like you're imposing on them because they've got lives too, right? And Lord, just today I'm feeling just that extra bit of loneliness. And can I come and sit on your lap? Can I get a hug? Can I bring myself close to you? And I believe that God wants that so desperately of us. He wants us to come close. He wants us to be, he wants us to know that he is that approachable. We can go to him, that we can say, Lord, I need a hug. And he will give it. You may not feel it physically, but you will surely feel it spiritually.
And I think,
I can vouch for that.
now I was going to say, when we talk about God sets the lonely in families, like God brought Monique and I into companionship. So in the sense that we literally do have a shoulder to cry on.
Yep.
And a hug when needed.
A
And
place to
it's not, yeah, and it's not a romantic relationship. So it's not the answer and the be all end all.
No.
It's the people that we surround ourselves with. And yes, you might, but it's not the fix for loneliness.
No.
And if we keep that on the pedestal or as our goal that's constantly moving away from us and we never seem to be able to get to it, then we're always going to feel alone because we aren't actually willing to or being open enough to find it in other ways.
Right.
And they're less.
And you can ask any married couple, they'll tell you, no matter how wonderful the marriage is, they're still going to have times of loneliness. Just a given human condition.
I mean,
And again,
Jesus,
the loneliness is not, as we saw in those verses, it's not meant to be filled by a single person.
Except for
Like,
God.
well, it's not meant to be filled by a single person. So if we think that some single person, in this case, our relationship partner, is going to be the fulfillment of loneliness, then we have an issue. But it's because it's God that fulfills us with that, and it is spread out from God through the people in our lives.
Right.
Like it's grace of God through Monique. It's the grace of God through David. It's the grace of God through my family that fulfills. So that like that companionship, that whatever the opposite of loneliness is, like fulfillment, that if, like I said, if you start looking and assuming that it's going to be this one person that's going to fix this in your life, then that is creating an unattainable expectation for the other person. And it's not fair. The other person or yourself.
It's not. A lot of insight can be gained into who you are. And that's one of the things that I found about myself when I spent, I don't know how many years it was alone, living by myself in my little condo, how I found myself going from depression to accepting that I was a single person and that this was my and to where I don't know if I want to share my space with anybody anymore, and to enjoying my space and enjoying my time alone. And I would grow an abundance of flowers out on my balcony, and I would just go crazy with what I painted, and I did things that I had never done before. And then I started getting into different kinds of music that I never thought I would ever listen to in my whole entire life because I didn't know it existed. And then going to Taekwondo and getting my black belt, and then finding friends, moving into a house.
And now you're sharing your space. At
Sharing
one
it.
point, you didn't think you wanted to. You have your own bedroom, which you don't have to share. Again, just putting it out
With-
there. But I'm just saying, like, you were able to now share a space with somebody and
Yeah.
not feel like it was like taking over your stuff.
Right.
I hope anyway.
Yeah, it was definitely a stepping out of a comfort zone because I didn't know what it was going to look like. But we're both very similar in personalities that it was just like, didn't we always do that?
It's hard to imagine before there was a before time. When I look back, I almost see that I was like so alone then, even though I didn't feel alone after my ex left. Like I was enjoying that. But I actually look back and go, wow, I was so alone in a sense. But I wasn't feeling that in the moment. But when I look back, I see it. And now I feel much more of a fulfillment because there's more enrichment in my life between having Monique, having David as our little brother, and then having my nieces and nephews visiting me and connecting with me a lot. And all of a sudden, I feel like an overwhelming abundance of anti-loneliness.
There you go.
I don't know. It's like a specific word that's the opposite of loneliness.
And we also have a pretty dynamic devotional time that neither of us had previously when we were even with our respective spouses, and then without our spouses, we didn't have that. I tried to have it with my husband, but it never worked. Tried to have it by myself, and that didn't work. Yeah, but now we're now a year and a half into our devotional time. I wouldn't miss it for the life of me because it's such a great time of communion. That
It's so exciting every single time.
What are we going to read this time?
Yeah, 2 days ago is all of Song of Solomon. That was fun.
Yes, it put all 8 chapters.
Chapters. Very descriptive.
Very descriptive. If I had to read embarrassing things, so do you. So there. But no, it's true. We sell ourselves short. We have our expectations too high. And we need to sometimes sit back and take stock of just exactly what it is that we think we're losing out on. Because if you think it's a sexual or romantic life, in a marriage, it's 2% of your life. Because the rest of your life is work.
Kids. Kids, taking your kids to things and from things.
We're just,
And then
more
other kids.
Yeah. So you really don't spend a whole lot of time, and then by the time you go to bed, you're too tired. You just want to sleep. So can seriously ask yourself what it is that you believe your life is lacking, that you think that somebody else is the only thing that will fill it.
And I think because I had the expectations of marriage and kids, even up to just around the time my ex left me and we separated, I had to come to the place of understanding, like, where I was actually okay if I didn't get remarried, and I was okay if I never had kids. It didn't mean that was definitely going to happen, but when I got to the place of being, this is okay. If it happens, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't change who I am or anything. That that opened me up to being able to be in a friendship with Monique to the point of where we are now. If I had been so locked in on, I wouldn't even be looking outside of myself. I just been looking for a guy, looking for a guy, looking for a guy. Like that would have been like I wouldn't even have seen the other opportunities or been open to the other opportunities that God was bringing along. And yet now I can barely imagine my life without it.
Isn't that funny, eh? Because I remember going through that same scenario. I was like, when it all of a sudden occurred to me that if I get married, great. If I don't get married, just as great. It makes no difference either way. I'm happy either way. I'm fine either way. And then all of a sudden, I live with a person and I have a house and stuff is like, no, I don't care either way either.
But it wasn't until I was able to take that focus off of these
Relationship.
assumptions, expectations, my own sin coming to dealing with this, putting it on as like a God object, which I hadn't realized, but came to the knowledge of. It wasn't until I was able to release that to God, come closer to God. Again, those verses, right? Going to God, He's there for you. And then He's, oh, we're going to put you in a family now. That we're all on the same page now. We're ready to go.
It's about time you guys got on the same page. I've been waiting for a long. For me, it feels like it took a long time for me to get there. But you know what? If I look back and think, I needed you to take a long time to get there because I needed you to wait for somebody.
What are you going to do?
What are you
And
gonna
God's
do?
also willing to take the time we need.
Yes, exactly.
He's not going to force you through it.
Although, I wowould have liked to have started taekwondo a little bit sooner. But then Master Choi wasn't there. And then it would have been a different school and it would have been
It would have been a whole different thing.
If you look back. Because how long had he been in business before we started?
I think he started in 2015.
Was he in the same location?
I think he was there from the
Oh.
beginning.
I remember when I first started, I remember getting out, because I think I did 6 months of private lessons. I remember him and I would walk to the dojo together some morning.
Because you had some unearthly hour doing your classes.
And he says, the only time I have really to do private lessons is 6 in the morning. So I'm up at 5:30 having breakfast and I'm walking with him to the dojo. Go on.
That's insane.
The moral of our stories is always to go to God, but also join Taekwondo.
That's the moral of our story. Join Taekwondo. No. And don't forget God. No.
And
wait a minute.
first, no second.
I was just going to say, hey, I got that. God first. Everything else second.
So anybody have anything to add before we finish up?
Go to
No.
God.
Go to God. Okay.
Go-
So that was our episode on loneliness. Hopefully, if you were feeling lonely, this helped a bit, gave you a path to try, opened up some possibilities. If you want to write to us, we're in the same place we always are. All of the social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, X. And if you want to email us, it's route77ministries@gmail.com. That's ROUTE 77ministries@gmail.com. And yeah, we'll see you all here next time.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
As we wrap up today's conversation on loneliness and singleness, I hope we've provided some new perspectives and food for thought. Remember, loneliness isn't reserved for those who are single, and it's not cured by simply entering into a relationship. It's about finding contentment and connection, often in places we least expect, through community, faith, and sometimes even through the challenges that force us to step out of our comfort zone. If this episode spoke to you, or if you have your own experiences with loneliness you'd like to share, reach out to us on our social platforms. We look forward to hearing from you. And until next time, keep finding your strength in each other and in your faith. And remember to live your single life to its fullest.